Steve, in your younger years, you saw yourself as an actor and nothing else.
Right.
Why do you think we put ourselves or lock ourselves into boxes?
Sometimes I think it's really about how we see the industry at first. How can I get in? What's my way in? What don't I see? What's my path? And I think I really identified early on with the people I was seeing on camera, like those characters, or trying to envision myself kind of in that world. I also think that people sometimes in the industry get connected to what's visible and not what's behind the scenes. So they don't really necessarily think about that the words are written, or that there's a director behind the camera, or that there are costume people or lighting people or makeup people. They just sort of go by the reality they see.
And what were some of those actors that you kind of wanted to emulate your career after?
Wow, that's so interesting. We were a big TV household when I was a kid, and we watched a lot of classic stuff. So a lot of like Norman Lear stuff and All in the Family and those sorts of things. I really thought of myself as wanting to be in the world of TV more than wanting to imitate somebody who was actually on TV. So I was really fascinated as a kid by the Brady Bunch, and I really wanted to be one of the Brady kids, and I kept thinking, what would it be like to be in that household and connected with those people and, part of that universe, part of those adventures. I started thinking about that.
Right, 8 is enough and things like that.
Yeah,
yep.
Right, all of those things,
right.
Yeah.
I remember it well.
Yeah.
In between acting gigs, you started writing?
I did. I certainly got to a point where I felt like the stuff I was getting to audition for wasn't juicy enough for me. It wasn't as interesting as things that I thought that I might create. It felt very, and also at the time there was the sense of the roles being smaller and more prescribed. I would be the guy next door, or I would be there weren't central roles for Black actors at the time. And so I really wanted to find a way to sort of bring myself more centrally to these stories and see what that would be like, and to create that myself. So that became the real impetus for wanting to make my own work. And I really feel like we're all better off as creators by bringing ourselves to the work more. I feel like in some ways, particularly American television, can be like one flavor of ice cream, and the more flavors we have in the mix, I think the better off we all are.
Can you talk about the time that you were ready to give up acting? If I remember correctly, was it before you moved to Baltimore or around that time?
I don't know that I ever had a moment where I was ready to give it up. I definitely had moments that were challenging in terms of the kind of work that I was getting or not getting, the kinds of auditions I was getting. And I certainly had a period of time in the later part of my time in New York where I would do a ton of corporate films. I did almost 100 corporate films. So stuff for like IBM and the Red Cross and MCI and all of that. And that was a really interesting time because I was working a ton, but nobody I knew and nobody in the industry, by and large, was seeing that work. And I think that became this sort of frustrating space. It was a perfect space in some ways for the kind of upscale energy that I was bringing to the on-camera work, but there wasn't a lot of that in episodic TV at the time.
Why did you leave New York for Los Angeles?
I knew that when I got an agent after playwriting school, and the first thing the agent said to me before they signed me was, "Are you interested in television?" And because I was such had grown up in a TV household and was really interested in TV from 5 years old, I knew for sure that I wanted to write in the world of TV and be part of the TV landscape, particularly for dramas, because those were the kinds of shows that I watched a lot as a kid. And I would fly out here to LA every year for like a week, and I would take all these meetings. My reps would arrange like 15 meetings in a week. So I'd have 3 meetings a day, and I'd fly in, I'd put myself up, and I would do all that. And every third or fifth person would say, you really have to live out here to do this. And I didn't really want to do that at the time, and it was, it seemed like an impediment to really getting work in the industry. And so at some point, it seemed to make sense to try it out, to see what it would be like to be here and roll the dice, being on the ground in LA, and so I made the decision.
Did you know anyone here, friend-wise?
I knew a
family?
bunch of people here. Yeah, I mean, from people from all the sort of stages of my life. I knew people from high school and college, and each of my graduate experiences, there was always one or two or three or five people here. So I just thought, I'm going to move over there and hang out with those other friends, those people I don't get to see as often. And so that also made it a little bit more of a soft landing for me to come to LA.
What happened your first year in Los Angeles?
My first year in LA was really challenging. I had moved, I was ready to go. I had an agent and a manager, which I felt really grateful for. And there were no meetings. I had spent all this time before I was here meeting all these folks. And then when that first year happened, it was like things had sort of dried up. And my reps were saying, well, you've met with everyone, which I don't really think is actually true. But I do feel like there's a space that I'm more familiar with now, which is much more about meeting people and keeping in touch, that results in a space of networking and a space of real conversations and sort of bringing my life into the industry and the industry into my life in a way that's much more sustainable than I'm going to meet somebody, I'm going to get a job, And so that first year was really hard. There wasn't a lot going on, which eventually changed for me when my manager suggested I apply to one of the diversity programs. So, and I had applied to many of the programs before that. And in fact, I wasn't really fond of that suggestion at the time, because I thought, I moved all the way across the country. I don't want an internship. Like, what? I'm here to earn money and all of that. But then I also realized I was just sitting around complaining about my life, and that I might as well jump into something different, try something new. And I applied to a bunch of programs, and I got into the CBS program, which is now the Paramount Writers Mentoring Program. And that really changed everything in terms of my perspective, knowing how to take meetings, knowing what people were looking for, how to research people, how to show up in that space, and a lot more about how the industry works.
And this was 2010?
That was I think I was in the class of 2011, and I got my first TV job in 2012, yeah.
Did you find LA lonely?
I didn't. I felt like I was prepared for that because, I'd heard a lot about LA before I got here, and I knew that my plan was to surround myself with friends, to surround myself with, I connected with the church, like almost as soon as I got here. I would have gatherings at my house, I would hang out with people, and I made it a point to make sure that I was breaking through the loneliness and not isolating. And it's something that I still work on and try to do. It's part of the mix of what makes, I think, my life in LA livable.
How did you get your first Hollywood television writing job?
My first job, I really owe, I think, my first job to the program, the CBS program that I was in, because we learned, Carol Kirshner, who runs the program, who's amazing, her whole focus was, in addition to, we did stuff with our scripts, and we met with a lot of people. There were executives who would come in, and showrunners and other writers, high-level writers, low-level writers, all sorts of people. And one of the things that she emphasized was how to introduce ourselves. And so we all had to come up with, at the time she was describing it as, a personal A story and maybe a B, C, or a D story that might fit a particular genre. And every week, even before the guest would come in, we would have to introduce ourselves to the class and practice our introduction. And this is one of those things that so many writers, the writers I meet with, the writers I run into, the people I coach, can get really sort of skittish around, well, what do I say about myself? And how do I do that in a way that's not self-conscious or, that's not rambling? And that was really part of the program where we we were drilled on that story, and we would get notes. Well, wait, maybe you should take out this, and maybe you should put in that. And what I realized is, one of the things I realized was that that story about how I talk about myself is a bridge to a connection with an executive or a showrunner or other writers, for them to not only know me on some level personally, but also to know a little bit about my writing brand, what I bring to the table, the way my mind works, all of that stuff. And that's one of the key elements of taking a meeting. You got to bring that in to tell a story about your life so that people get a sense of what kind of storyteller you are. And so that, and a number of other things that I learned: how to research people, how to be fundamentally and deeply interested in the material that, if I'm coming in for a show that, that you created, how do I match or find my life mirrored in that show and talk about it? Because the more I can say something genuinely connected to the material, again, the more I demonstrate to that showrunner or executive that I can tell stories about the lives of those characters, because my life has some parallel to the lives of those characters. And those were among the things I started to do in meetings and interviews, and I think that made a difference in terms of getting hired.
Yeah, Carol, we've talked to her twice, and I know the last time we talked to her, she talked about the sort of the story and letting people know who you are, but nothing where they would almost feel guilty, or
Yes, right.
we're in
You don't
this
make
new
people
age.
Uncomfortable, sure.
Yeah, of like, well, this happened to me, and this, and that's great in the sense that we can bond with others over different things, but we didn't want to do it where we push people away, where they felt like sort of guilty about your story. So, yeah.
I think the best kind of story to tell is one that opens up a conversation, where there's a little bit of, Carol calls them nuggets, a little bit of a nugget about who you are, that people can say, oh, tell me more about growing up on a farm, or, or how your father was a magician, or whatever it is, that kind of opens up a dialogue.
What is your story now, Steve?
The story I tell people, which is true, is my father is a major Catholic, believes in the books of the church. My mother believes in the books of the horror section of the bookstore. So I would come home from Catholic school and say, Mom, what's happening in Salem's Lot? And she would fill me in. And consequently, I write about what I call the invisible things. And sometimes that literally involves ghosts or spirits. Sometimes it involves things I think people aren't talking about, like race or sexuality or politics or religion. And usually in an original piece, a protagonist of mine steps into some world where there's an element that they don't know about, and by the end they have to make peace with that element.
How did you feel about The Exorcist growing up?
Growing up, well, the fascinating thing about that aspect of my story is my mother would give me her interpretations of these horror pieces, but I never wanted to watch them because they freaked me out too much. So I would rather hear her tell me about them and then sort of observe perhaps how those stories worked or how they made me feel, but I would kind of stay away from, to this day, I'm not a horror movie fan. I'm just intrigued by the notion that there are other things going on in the universe that we don't know about and perhaps that we can't see. And I think where my writing lands most often is in the space of magical realism, rather than sort of out and out horror, even though I, sort of grew up adjacent to that space.
We had this comment come in yesterday under one of our videos, and it is, how do you guys write if you have people around you? I find it very hard. I feel antisocial, and they keep talking to me. Wife and kids can be hard on your writing.
I think you gotta negotiate with your loved ones. That's one of the things that I tend to do. And also to find ways to carve out time to be able to say to family members, I need X amount of time, or I'm gonna be working for this hour or the next hour and a half. I also find that there are times that I can put on headphones and white noise and kind of go into a space where I can concentrate pretty fully. I think partly for me that comes from growing up in New York. I've written on subways and in parks and coffee shops, and there's kind of a way to kind of find a Zen moment in the middle of busyness that can sometimes work for me.
Is there an amount of time that you schedule to write daily, no matter what?
That's such a good question. I feel like we writers get really hung up on amount of time to write. And so I don't have a number of hours, minutes, but I think of writing the way I think of eating. I talk about this a lot as an analogy. So I eat every day, right? Sometimes 3 meals, most often 3 meals. Sometimes it's on the run. Sometimes it's a meal that sort of takes hours, like Thanksgiving, where I'm there for, hanging out, grazing, And I feel like as long as I have a relationship with my eating, then my body stays healthy and I bring in the nutrients and all that stuff. I feel the same way about writing. Sometimes I'm dropping in for 15 minutes or half an hour or an hour. It depends on what the day looks like, how many other appointments I have. Many of those appointments are connected to my writing life. Producing things, or if I'm pitching a project. But I try to drop in on a regular basis, 5 days a week, to some extent. And sometimes that'll extend to several hours, and sometimes I'll just grab a little bit of time. But as long as I keep touching the work, I feel like for me, that's the goal.
Okay, interesting. So sometimes it'll be sitting down to enjoy this, 6-course meal, and other times it'll be eating a breakfast burrito on the go or something.
Yes, that's right.
Okay, just real quick and...
Yeah. So I might have a notion of a scene that I want to fix or touch, or a quick outline, or a quick hit on... this morning I was working on a play that I've been writing, and I had some ideas about stuff, and I just dropped in. I started reading from the beginning. I made a few tweaks. And I ended up actually working for 2.5 hours, but sometimes it'll just be 30 minutes or 15 or 45. And as long as I continue to show up in that way on a regular basis, I feel good about it.
Can you talk about the importance of setting goals and how this has become what seems like a guiding force in your life?
Goals. I think for me, goals can be pretty elusive partly because I think we live in a culture where there are so many things going on. People often talk about busyness as a badge of success, and so I can and do end up having more projects in my head and on my list than I can actually get to. And I have to negotiate with myself in a given part of the year around what am I actually working on? Where and how am I actually showing up? And then I think within that space, if I say, okay, it's these 3 projects for now, I try to give myself deadlines, or I try to give myself benchmarks. I'm in a writing group, and so I know, I'm coming up to this date where I'm going to need to present material. So I need to prioritize getting to that material before those dates. Or I'm about to have this meeting with this producer, and I need to have moved a little further in terms of the pitch document or the character arcs or whatever it is. So I tend to attempt to set goals for myself and get the outside world to help me keep track of what is the priority today or this week or this month by inviting other people into my process and leaning into deadlines whenever I can.
And I'm not sure if I heard this on your Secret Writer podcast with your co-host Nick Job, is it? That you felt frustrated at one point because, you've gone to Yale, you have an education that, some people, wouldn't even be able to match. Mm-hmm. But you felt like you still had to prove yourself over and over again. You got frustrated, and then you said, I just want to be happy doing work. And sort of that, forgive me if I'm butchering the story a little bit, but that you decided at one point that you weren't going to be disgruntled about it. You just wanted to just start doing projects.
Yes, there's a part of me, and I think this is true of many writers, probably most of us, where there's the part where there's the desire to create, and there's, of course, the desire to make a living. Sometimes those things overlap, and sometimes they don't. And so I find that for me, super grateful to have written on, 6 shows over 8 seasons of TV. And at the same time, when I'm not in that space, when I'm not in a writer's room, I want to be working on the next whatever it is, whether it's a play, whether it's a long play or a short play, whether it's a web series or a short film or a TV pilot. I'd rather find myself busy, creatively busy, employing myself with things that really interest me and things that really excite me. I'd rather be doing that, and find a way to combine them eventually. But in the time when I'm not working, working for somebody else, bringing in an active paycheck, that notion of just trying to nurture the next artistic thing becomes really important to me. It's like exercise. I just want to keep at it so that I keep those muscles going, so that I keep entertaining myself, so that I keep creating new stuff.
Does that help, on days or, coming out of the writer's strike, whatever, where it's easy to fall into an inertia and just be depressed and, I don't want to do this anymore.
Yeah.
Is it easy for you to set these goals?
I think, I don't know if it's easy to set the goals, but I do think that I'm really aware of this dichotomy between, like capitalism and creativity. So when those two things can be combined, great. But I think far too often, some of the writers that I meet and that I work with want to think of creativity only in terms of capitalism. And that if their creativity is not bringing in money right now, then there's a disconnect from the idea of creating anything. And I want to keep those things going together as much as I can. My father is a visual artist, and he made his living as an art teacher primarily, and yet he was always doing stuff. And I feel like I've taken an aesthetic from him. He was always painting or drawing or doing silkscreen or puppetry or collage. There was always something that he was up to, and that's kind of the philosophy that I try to bring with me.
Why is it important for you to finish a screenplay, a novel, a play, anything that you're working on? Why is finishing important to you?
I got advice from a teacher in playwriting school, get to the end. Marcia Norman, won the Pulitzer Prize for Night and Mother, and that was her big advice to us as students and to me in particular. I have to say, I haven't. It's not like I've finished everything I've started, but there is something incredibly valuable about getting to the end, and then once I've gotten to the end, then I have something. I have something that I can tweak or mold or shape or change, or people say all the time, writing is rewriting. So it's harder to rewrite, I think, if I haven't created an entire piece. If I'm just tinkering with the first scene forever, then I think there's a greater chance that I'm going to put the piece away. But if I get all the way to the last scene and keep going back and keep, moving through the process, I think I can better give life to the material. And so, getting to the end and finishing becomes really important, because on some level, unless there's a deadline, you're never really finished. You can come to end of scene, end of play, or end of pilot, and then you can, of course, go back when you get notes, if you get notes, when you take it to your writer's group, when you have a new inspiration, when the world changes in some way. But having a piece that is whole is an amazing platform for kind of the next level. So I feel like it's really important to do that.
Did you watch your father finish things? I know with visual artists, there's a different, it's never finished, and
Yes.
we've heard of these famous painters throughout time wanting paintings back as they weren't done with him.
To a certain extent, Dad has finished a bunch of things and also not finished other things, and I think I've observed that from him. I've seen the joys and the challenges of what it means to complete something and to sign it at the end and frame it somehow and celebrate its existence because there's some completion to it. And I also know the challenge of, still working on this piece, so I feel like I've been able to weigh for myself the differences there, and it's much more satisfying to get to the end, even if it's not perfect. Which is the other thing, like we're always talking, if we listen to reviewers, if we listen to people who say perfect performance or perfect film or perfect, there is no such thing as the perfect any piece of art. Like it's always flawed in some way. So moving to a sense of creating something that is finished, imperfectly finished, is, I think, a much better and healthier space to be in than, holding on to it because it's not perfect. Because nothing will ever be, that ideal thing. And I think that the corollary to that is we all do this. We go to see plays and movies and TV shows, and we sit there and sometimes in a healthy way, sometimes in an unhealthy way, we critique the piece. So if I'm seeing lots of material over and over again, none of which is perfect, then why am I holding myself to this standard of perfection? Why not allow my pieces to live as much as that flawed piece on TV or that wonderful but flawed piece of theater? It's only fair to me that I can bring my same perfect, imperfect piece to life just like anybody else.
Why does a screenwriter need a logline for their television or film?
The logline is the map. It's the through line, it's the space that I think guides everything. And I certainly know in the playwriting world, there's lots of opportunity, and I've done this and do it sometimes myself, where I come up with a character and I just start writing, or I come up with a small circumstance. But what I've learned in the TV world is without knowing who the central character is, what they're trying to do, and what they're up against, those three things which I think need to be in every log line, then a piece will just sort of ramble. It'll just sort of become this kind of thesis of a character's opinion, or it just won't feel galvanizing for an audience. And so the log line, that sort of central thought, that central idea crystallized, in language is an essential piece to hold on to, I think, when creating anything dramatic.
What is your logline formula?
Yeah, my favorite logline formula is, this is a story about blank, who's trying to blank in spite of blank. And so again, you get who that protagonist is, and you can fill in other stuff, not only their name, but some relevant detail about who they are in the world, or how they come across, or where they are in their lives. Who is trying to or struggling to blank, which is about what they're trying to get done. What's the goal of this person? Where are they headed? What are they trying to achieve? And then in spite of X. And there could be several X's. There could be a person, there could be a circumstance, there could be a physical ailment, there could be mental impairment, there could be something as big as the end of the world. But as long as you have those three elements, the person, what they're trying to do, what they're up against, then I think you've got a good spine for creating something interesting.
Do you find with the people that you take on, that you consult, that they struggle with this part? Or most of them know it when they come to you?
It depends. I'm actually teaching a class now with students who are finding it challenging. And I think one of the reasons people find the logline challenging is that we're all used to the TV guide logline. The TV guide logline is much more diffuse, and it's much more to sort of bring in an audience. It's not necessarily a tool for a screenwriter. So you'll see in the TV guide logline, something about, this is a story about the 1950s and a group of people who, are discovering themselves amid the backdrop of blah, blah, blah. Well, that doesn't really tell me who it's about, which I always think comes down to primarily one person. It doesn't tell me anything about what they're trying to do. It tells me a lot about the atmosphere, and it doesn't tell me anything about the obstacle. So I think often when people step into the space of writing for the first time, or even those of us who've been doing it for a while, it's really important to remind ourselves to crystallize it down to those particular elements so that we have a through line and that we really know what we're doing, hopefully thematically and on every page of our script from beginning to end. It's a really great guidepost to have.
And this would be the same for a playwright?
Yes.
To plug in? Okay.
I think it's all the same. Yeah. I mean, I think the form becomes different about how that gets executed. The theater scenes can be much longer. And of course, the drama has to be crystallized between several people. You don't get a lot of, special effects, or sometimes you do in certain Broadway circumstances or whatever, but it's really focused on emotional, psychological struggles between people, power dynamics, those sorts of things. But I think the essence is the same, to say who's it about, what are they trying to do, what are they up against.
Do you always write a logline before you write a screenplay?
If I am writing something for TV, I will always write a logline before I write a TV piece. I think in my process of writing plays, it can be different. I have started with characters talking, or circumstances where two people meet and they start talking. And then at some point, though, I'll realize when I get to sort of a space of diminishing returns that I need to know more, sort of as the god of that universe, like what's really going on. And then I will back up and I will say, okay, which of these characters is the protagonist, and what exactly are they trying to do, and what is in their way. And so I always come back to a logline if I don't start with one, but in the TV world, I always start with one. And I certainly, if I'm in the rare instance, which actually happens a lot here in LA, where I'm pitching a project that I haven't written, the logline absolutely comes first, because I need to be able to crystallize it in order to sell it to a buyer or to communicate to somebody what it is I'm doing, particularly because it's not on the page yet. So I definitely do that first.
What are your thoughts on writing a vague logline because you don't want to give away the story?
I don't think a vague logline helps a writer, right? It's great for an audience. I mean, I can understand not giving away a story to an audience if the audience are the paying customers. But from inside the process, if it's the writer's room, if it's me inside my brain, I have to know where we're going. Otherwise, how can I chart the journey? Similarly, for if I'm selling a project to somebody, and you're the buyer, you're Warner Brothers or whoever, you've got to know, if you're going to pay me money to allow me to write this and help create it, then you have to know what you're buying. So I shouldn't, the same sort of mystery that I play out with an audience should never be, I think, the mystery that I'm going to play out either with myself, my collaborators, or somebody who's going to buy the property, because they need to be on board. They need to be on board with the journey. And so, so all things can be revealed in the inner circle, but then with the audience, then I'll hold some things back so that they can enjoy the journey.
How many loglines for one story will you write?
It depends on the story. I think for many of my plays, there's usually one central one, and I will, I'm writing a play right now that only has 4 characters in it. So it's really about the journey of this one particular character. I think in the world of TV, when we have the breadth to tell more stories, as we normally do, usually there's an A, B, and C story, if not a D and an E story, then I think it's much easier to have parallel stories that hopefully thematically either bounce off each other or sort of traffic in the same territory. So I think maybe for me, 3 up to 5 in the world of a TV script, and usually 1 or maybe 2 in a play.
Does each television episode have its own logline?
Yes, each television episode does have its own logline, and often because there are multiple stories, there may be several loglines in a given TV episode. One of the things that's interesting about that to me is that being in a bunch of writers' rooms, we don't always discuss that. Like, we all bring in my experience, we all bring our techniques into the space, but then we're following the showrunner toward, what he, she, or they is interested in doing. So we may start talking about a story in general terms, and I will invariably come up with my own logline, which I may or may not share with the entire group. I'm not being the showrunner, but it will help me understand how to proceed through the story, and it will give me clues as to what I might suggest as we continue breaking story. So I'll clarify that for myself. But I certainly think, every every story, every A, B, or C story, and every episode has its own log line. Each particular installment has, what this character is up against. Usually we know who the main character is, of course, if we're watching the show for that particular person, but what they're up against is specific and unique, and what they're trying to do may also be specific and unique in that episode.
And what about for a play, each act? Would you have sort of your own log line, or it's not really necessary because you have a general theme?
Yeah, it's really about one log line for the whole play, and then it's about how this, where we are in the structure, the beginning, middle, and end of it. Are we in the midst of the conflict? Which usually what I will do is I will get to the height of the conflict, or some sort of cliffhanger, and that's where the act break will be of a 2-act play, and so I'll be like, okay, we're at this point, and now I'll say, intermission. But in that middle space of the play where all the conflict is, then I sort of know that I'm playing out this person trying to get whatever through these obstacles. And then, so I know at the end of the play, I'm going towards some sort of resolution. At the beginning of the play, I'm sort of ramping up into what the conflict is, but it's all one big story.
Will you research log lines that are in a similar genre and tone with the story that you want to write?
I don't know that I'm able to find what the original sort of useful, helpful log line is for a writer in any of my research. So I don't really know. I can't really tell you like what logline Shonda Rhimes, for example, was working with to create Grey's Anatomy. But I can watch the show, and that's often what I'll do. I will watch something and I will sort of intuit and create a log line that matches that particular show or movie so that I can have, sort of a mental construct to hang my experience of that TV show or movie or play on. I can say, okay, now that I understand that this is a show about X trying to do Y in spite of Z, then I can watch it and see how that plays out throughout. And I can say that's probably approximately what that writer used, with probably different language. But I can learn from that. I can learn from being able to watch something and then reverse engineer what the log line probably is.
How do you begin writing a new story?
I think everything that I write that's original comes out of some inner obsession. So something I am freaked out about or obsessed with or afraid of or that I can't stop thinking about. There's always some core kernel of interest that comes out of that space. So even, one of the examples that I often use, and I haven't written anything about this, is for whatever reason, like I'm not a coffee drinker, but I know a ton of, almost everybody is a coffee drinker. So if I go there, if I start with that kind of, the question underneath that for me would be, why are people so interested in this thing that I'm not interested in? What does that mean about me? What does that mean about them? And I can mine that into perhaps a story about how valuable coffee is. Perhaps it's contraband in a world where coffee is rare. Perhaps there's somebody who doesn't like coffee who's hoarding this substance, right? So suddenly I begin to brainstorm something from this obsession that starts to manifest into a big question and then a character, and then who is that character? And then who is that character up against? Who is the person who's trying to get the coffee from this person? And suddenly, my brain is populating with all these ideas. And then I will solidify the character, solidify that antagonist, make clear decisions around what they're trying to do, and maybe there are other things they're up against. Maybe it's illegal to hoard the coffee and the police are involved. I don't know. But then I will create a log line from that. And begin to sort of sketch out the beginning, middle, and end, and then start using index cards to think of brainstorm moments. And then I'm off to the races. Then I'm sort of into the space of outline from that kernel of an idea.
That's interesting. Yeah, I know there's the tea drinkers, and then there's the coffee people, just like cat and dog people.
Yes.
And, and I think it's just a matter of palate, but yeah,
Right.
It is fascinating as someone who's feels addicted to coffee. I can't see how anyone wouldn't need it in the morning.
Right.
But yeah, I know there's some people that are repulsed by it. So yeah, that's a good analogy. I like that. How do you put ideas into a beat sheet?
I think for me, the beat sheet comes after I've done my, I'll do my brainstorming on index cards. So I will, I'll have a log line. The log line always suggests, what my beginning, middle, and end are going to be. I'm a big fan of Sid Field's description of dramatic structure, and he talks about how, there are these, in every story there are two plot points. He calls them plot points, and one is the moment that takes us from the beginning to the middle, sends us into the conflict. It's an event that as he says, spins the story in a new direction. So, and then on the other side of the conflict, there's what he calls plot point 2 that spins the story into a new direction, but this time toward a resolution. So the first thing that I do when I'm coming up with a story is I will put those events, those two plot points, on 2 index cards. One index card for plot point 1, one index card for plot point 2, which, that's the beginning and ending of my conflict. And then I'll just say to myself, well, what else needs to happen? What needs to happen before that moment? What needs to happen in between, in the heart of the conflict? What needs to happen toward the end? And I just start writing on index cards and almost stream of consciousness. Well, I need this, I need this, I need this, I need this, I need this. And I'll just keep making cards, as many as I can, until I run out of ideas. And I'll put them in order. And then once I have them, I'll go through and I'll separate out, I don't think I need that, or these two are the same, or, right? And then once I have those, then I'll start to, if I'm satisfied with the order and what is a loose structure at that point, I'll put those moments in a document, one after the other, and that's my beat sheet. This will happen first. This will happen second. This will happen third, and then I'm creating basically a list of actions that are going to take me and the character through the entire journey of the script.
And with some of the people that you coach, do you notice that they are mistaken about where their conflict is, or usually they know that better than anything?
I think often they have challenges crystallizing the conflict. They'll know that it generally has to do with liberation, or looking at their life, a character's life, in a new way. But they won't necessarily say it's really about this person struggling to free themselves from a bad marriage. Like they'll be more general than specific usually. And then we have to sort of nail it down. Okay, great, I get the notion of liberation. How does that manifest? What's actionable about that? Like, what are the scenes we're gonna see? Because we can't just see a scene of liberation, but if we talk about a marriage breaking up, or if we talk about somebody moving away from home, suddenly I can see scenes, packing a bag, getting on a train, getting money, running away, making phone calls, calling a lawyer. Like suddenly I'm into action space. Sometimes I have to invite people to step into more specifics in order to be able to, get an actionable, dramatic circumstance going.
What about new writers who put too much conflict and it needs time to sort of simmer?
Yeah, I mean, that certainly happens. I think on some level as a writing coach, I prefer that, because then there's more there rather than less there. We can always, in the same way that we can always rewrite, we can always take away stuff. So I prefer people showing up with a bunch of ideas of actionable things that they can put into their material. And then we can talk about whether we need all those things, or whether some of those things are actually the same thing. Whether the same scene where somebody, gets a divorce is the same scene where they, the couple actually comes to blows, or whatever. Like there are things that can overlap. There are actions that can become the same. And so I'd rather have an abundance of things coming from somebody I'm working with than less, which actually sort of goes to the way TV works. we throw out a bunch of ideas in the writer's room. And I heard somebody say, which I think is really smart, that you have to sort of build a mountain of the bad ideas to get to the good ideas. So the more ideas, the better, and then you can always pare away and make some decisions. I think that can be useful.
But what are your thoughts on opening with conflict? Like if we go back to this coffee smuggler analogy, which is great, what if we open with, somebody breaks into their car in a parking lot, they just went to go get their own coffee, and somebody jimmies the lock and there's all this coffee beans, they take it out, and then there's a fight and someone's killed.
Yes, I mean, you can definitely start with action. And I think it's important to recognize that you still need the structure. There's always going to be beginning, middle, and end. So if you start with action, then my question for that is that action somewhere in the middle of the conflict? And so is that a flashback? Are we going to go back and then tell the audience how we got here, and so therefore have a beginning that ramps up to that moment? Or if we're going to start in this moment that has action and that kind of damage, are we going to come to some other turning point? Is it going to be that our person with the coffee gets taken hostage, and the movie is really about the hostage crisis of this character and how that person's going to liberate themselves from that. So I think you can definitely start with action. The question is, where is that in the structure of what you're trying to do with this character? I think the hope is always to be engaging with your audience. So we do that a lot in TV. You might have a show like, on Tracker, the show that I was just working on, the pilot starts in the middle of a crisis with him doing a rescue. And then the story that happens in the pilot is an entirely different rescue. So you can do that too, where you start with action and adventure to bring people in, but then your story is going to unfold with a different circumstance.
Can you explain the difference between a beat sheet, a treatment, and an outline?
A beat sheet, a treatment, and an outline. It sort of depends on who you're working for, especially in the TV world. There are so many interchangeable things that we call different things. For me, the beat sheet is a very skeletal list of what the moments are in your script. Joe goes to the gas station to get cigarettes. Joe finds a turtle running down the street and goes after it. Just very skeletal kind of descriptions listed on a page. To me, that's a beat sheet. A treatment is more, I think, especially in the TV world, it's more analogous to what we call, two things. We have this thing called a story area in the world of TV, which is a general description for usually the studio or network to say, here's the overview of what we're doing in this episode. Here are some of the characters. It involves this creepy town. Our protagonist is going to discover this and this about himself. These sorts of mysteries will get revealed, and it gives kind of atmosphere and energy to invite them to say to us, go ahead and write that. That sounds really juicy. So that's more of what I would call a treatment, which we call story area in TV space. And the outline is, in the TV world, I often think of it and have heard it called a narrative outline, which essentially is you take the beat sheet and you write what I call the short story version of your story from beginning to end. So if it's Joe goes to the gas station for cigarettes, that first section of your outline is going to say, it's a sunny Tuesday and Joe stumbles into it's going to give me more of an energy of what's happening with the character, what the locations are, what perhaps some of the energy, does he walk inside this gas station and has an interaction with a surly gas station clerk? I'm not going to include dialogue, but I'm going to say that. I'm going to give some feeling, some moment-by-moment short story kind of feeling about that story, and give that for every scene in the episode. And usually in the TV world, comes to about 10 to 15 pages. And that's where anybody can pick that up, not knowing anything about my show or my character, and really get the download and the flow of the story. And so that's like a fundamentally different kind of document that kind of gives every moment in a narrative description.
How much time do you spend outlining a story, and how do you know when you're ready to write the screenplay?
I spend as much time outlining a story as I feel like the story needs. It's sort of a matter of how much the story needs and how impatient I get. And that's when I know that it's time to move on. Like if I'm really energized and ramped up to jump into the scenes are sort of popping off the page to me and I'm feeling called by them. That's when I'm like, okay, great, I'm ready. And that's definitely once it's all down. I really have to get to the end so I really know what all of those scenes are. And then there just comes a moment when I feel pulled toward creating dialogue and knowing more about those moments. And it tells me, I think, in a way, as odd as that seems, it just says it's time.
Well, you seem very disciplined to me. Maybe, I don't know if that's true or not, but...
Sort of.
Okay.
Sometimes.
Well,
depends.
It seems convincing, but do you notice that with some of the people that you work with, though, that maybe they do, for lack of a better term, sort of an ADHD, and they want to just jump right to stuff, and it ruins it in the end because, or there's holes in the story?
Yes, I do notice that. I see a lot of writers who are really impatient to get to all of the juice of the story, which I understand and I respect. And at the same time, my concern for them is that, and I spent a lot of time doing this myself earlier in my writing process, where I would start things and I would only get so far. I used to write attempt to write lots of short stories and short pieces or novels, and I would only get, I would just peter out at some point because I had no idea where I was going. There was no structure, there was no energy, there was no guiding force, there was no log line, there was just that one scene. And so I try to steer people toward the outline space and walk them through that process simply to give them enough structure that then on some level, once you've thought that much about it, even though you'll continue to rewrite, there's a way in which it almost writes itself. You just know, like, okay, this moment is here and it's going to lead into this other moment. And then that moment's going to lead into this one and that moment's going to lead into this one. It becomes much easier to move through a story when you have the architecture of it already worked out. So I really urge people to move to that space before jumping into those later pieces.
So to go back to Joe at the gas station, there's going to be a reason. It's not just going to be a random scene where he needs cigarettes. He's going to bump into someone, or the clerk's going to accuse him of, your ID doesn't look like you. This isn't, and there's going to be, that's going to set off a sequence.
Yes, there are definitely going to be those things that kind of clue us into other things about Joe and what he's like. What maybe why is he smoking cigarettes at all? Is he nervous? Is he restless? Is he anxious? Is he desperate? And how much money does he have to buy them? Does he have not much? Is he spending his last? All of those things are going to hopefully be clues that tie us to some of the later events that then make the story that much more fun.
What's your research process?
My research process is. It tries to be thorough, but it's also all over the map. And a lot of it depends on what I'm up for. I try to open up to the space of the possibility that I can get what I need almost anywhere and that I can decide I've had enough at almost any point. So often I will start out with books. I will say, well, what books can I get? How can I may buy things or I may go to the library. I'm a big documentary watcher, so if I can watch either a long or a short documentary on YouTube, that's cool. Or if I can have somebody, help me do research. But the thing that I love the most about research is really to talk to people. I'm often saying, well, I'm working on a piece now and I reached out to somebody who I went to college with who's a physician. And I was like, tell me about your job. Like, what happens in hospitals and how does this work? And that's so much more fun because the person has, they're there to answer all my questions and to also give their own personal reflections about not only here's what happens, but here's what it feels like, and here's what's frustrating about it, and here's what I love about it. And all of those things start to inform. And then I feel like there's a moment where I just feel like I've had enough. Now, you can always do more research. That's one of those things. You can research for the rest of your life. And so I have to decide at some point, this is good enough to get me started, or this feels like enough to write this scene. And, and I can always come back. I can always, take that piece, share it with the person I talk to, or rewatch the documentary and then rewrite the piece. But I do get to a point where I just feel like, okay, I have enough to know how to fashion this dialogue and what the scene should feel like, and I'm just going to dive in.
What about when it comes to a crime story, and maybe you're doing a brand new one, it's not based on a true crime event, but you can't necessarily maybe speak to someone that's incarcerated or law enforcement or an attorney. So how do you research that?
It's both documentaries, research, or imagination, things I've read. What would it feel like to be in this circumstance? I also think this is where my acting background comes in handy, because I can cultivate pretty well from my imagination what certain circumstances feel like. I can't know all the details of being incarcerated, for example, but I know what it's like to be lonely. I know what it's like to be isolated. I know what it's like to be, in a room by myself. I know what it's like to watch the clock and feel trapped. I know what it's like to watch the sun sort of move across the sky, or to watch an insect crawl across the room, or, I know what all those things are like. And so I rely on those things when I don't have other things, and and those bits of research that I can have, I bring along with me, and then I see what happens, and that's also where, too, on the other side of it, to have readers, to have other people to chime in and say, oh, well, I love this, but I'm missing this, or this seems cool, but what about X, or it might feel more this or that, or have you thought about this? That also helps me kind of round out my approach to anything I haven't lived and I haven't been able to research.
You spoke earlier about riding on the subway and stuff. I think in any major city, taking public transportation or a Greyhound across country, I mean, you can just soak in so much fascinating situations, and some things you don't want to be around, but you have no choice. You're kind of stuck. And then others that you're like, wow, I wonder what that's all about right there. And to someone with an active imagination, it can be a gold mine.
Yeah, it's cool. There's also something useful about the kind of isolation of that, or the I guess I want to call it like being trapped in a way. I mean, obviously, if I'm on an airplane, I'm not literally trapped, but I can't go anywhere. If I'm not into the Wi-Fi, I can't do social media, I can't distract myself. Maybe there's something I can watch on YouTube or whatever if I've got the capability. But quite often those are great places for me to write, just because it's like there are fewer distractions than in my normal life, and I can just flow into this space of focus and concentration that becomes really delightful.
How much time do you spend crafting the ending of a story?
Sometimes, I think it depends on the ending of the story. There are pieces that I've written where I knew the ending first, where I just got an image, or I knew it ends up with X. And the question becomes, how do I get there? So sometimes that happens and the ending is not in doubt. It's just a matter of navigating toward it. Sometimes I know that I'm going to some sort of resolution with some characters, but I have no idea what it looks like. And then I'll have to try several endings, or I'll write it one way and then I'll let some readers read it, or I'll gather people to read it, or obviously I'll read it over myself and then I'll find something else, or I'll find something else. And sometimes it's a matter of substituting to see what the right ending is. I think there are a number of different ways to find an ending, and sometimes it's a roll of the dice as to which one is going to fit best. And sometimes that's about audience or sensibility or tone. I mean, that's the other thing too. Like if you're, Shakespeare ends his comedies, there's always there's stuff in nature, there's the forest, there's the meadow, there's something that lightens the mood. So am I going for an ending that's going to feel comic and hopeful? Am I going for an ending that's going to feel slightly despairing and sobering? And then what's the right moment of that? What's the right combination of events and words and people and circumstances and images that will help sort of land the plane in a way in terms of that story. Yeah, sometimes I just have to try a bunch of things out and see what happens. And I think like every piece I write, they're all individual. Sort of it takes what it takes for this particular piece. Sometimes that's, months, sometimes it's been years. It's like I don't know exactly where I'm going, or I can't really finish this, or I need this collaborator, and then I'll discover it eventually and find my way to whatever ending feels right.
And then with the writers that you work with, coaching, do they often know what the ending is when they approach you to look over their, analyze their screenplay?
Yeah, I think not always. I think it's sort of 50-50 actually. There are some people who know where they're going, and there are other people who just know what the journey is. And so it's really, I think I try to lean into my coaching process the way I lean into my own process, which is I try to meet myself wherever I am in terms of the work and sort of, I talk a lot about like blessing the process, like whatever it is, it's okay. I mean, to go back to my eating analogy, sometimes I'm like, this is definitely what I'm gonna have for dinner. And other times it's like, I don't quite know. What do I have in here? What can I make? What can I, sometimes I discover the taste along the way, and sometimes I know exactly what will satisfy me. And I think the same is true of my writing and the writing of people I work with.
How soon in the writing process will you know what your character wants?
Pretty early on, I will know generally what my character wants. Partly because it comes out of that obsession space. So if I'm dealing with some large theme that they are pursuing, then I will know, they want X. At the same time, I will rewrite my logline. I will write some material and I will come back to it. And I will say, do I really know? Do I really remember? Can I make it sharper? I'll do that quite a bit. But I think pretty early on, I have characters who come to mind who are headed for something pretty specific. And sometimes I just need to drill down on maybe what that looks like in this particular universe. But it comes pretty quickly.
Can you talk about character flaws and why every character has to have them?
Character flaws, I don't know. I think that's what makes characters fun and sweet and dear and interesting, is the way they stumble over themselves to do whatever it is they're trying to do. I think as a kid, I always felt like I would watch movies and be envious of the fact that this particular character knew what to say to that particular character. I'd be like, wow, what a great comeback. Like, I wish I was like that in real life, But I think I've come to really appreciate my own stumbling around. And I love to see that with characters on things that I watch, like sort of the haltingness or the mistakes or the, when a surgeon accidentally kills somebody on the table, like those are the moments, emotionally, dramatically, where I lean in and I want to know, I think, as a human question, how do we come back from those mistakes? How do we come back from, these things that people are not able to do when we assume incorrectly that we should be able to do everything? And so I feel like all of those things make characters seem more human and more real by having them be imperfect. So the question then becomes for me as I work on a character, like what is the flavor of the imperfection of this particular character as opposed to that particular character? What is this character good at and what is that character not so good at? I'm really interested in that.
I think you mentioned about Tony Soprano that one of the reasons you really love watching him is he's in therapy, and he knows to some extent that his life is not working for him.
Yes, that really works for me. I'm not a fan of, and never have personally been a fan of, the anti-hero, because I feel like, probably has to do with my, growing up Catholic, and, there's always this sense of what is the what's the moral imperative? Is there one? Like, what do we care about? What do we, where is there the space for trying to get it right? And what does it mean when we think we're not getting it right? And that doesn't necessarily obviously have to be in any sort of spiritual or religious context. But the notion of this guy who, to all intents and purposes is an anti-hero, but he's like, is this a good thing for me? Should I be like this with my family, with my career? Do I need to fix stuff? That, to me, that's really relatable. And I'd like to see that more in characters. I'm not, characters who just get away with murder and are really happy about it. I don't relate to those shows. And so I kind of step out of that because it doesn't feel real to me. But him going to therapy feels real to me.
Do you think having a character that feels guilt, it could be religious guilt, it could be just maybe they gave up a child or something, something that it's so fascinating to watch because we've all been there in some way or another. And
yeah, I think it is fascinating to watch because we've been there. It's also fascinating to watch because there's a certain swath of characters that don't go there. We've seen that for decades in movies and TV too. So the notion of the sort of in between, we so often in whatever it is, in our politics, in our fashion, whatever it is, like, do's and don'ts, rights and wrongs, and to see a character who lives in the middle, who's trying to navigate the middle and trying to say, well, maybe this part is good and maybe this part is not so good, that's fascinating to me.
How does a writer get inside the head of their character?
I think for me, getting inside the head of a character is, it's essentially an exercise in empathy, and it's an exercise, it feels very much connected to me to acting work. It's the notion of being able to sort of soak up the given circumstances and be able to say to myself, what would it feel like if I could do X or Y? Like, what's the intoxication of power if I'm the CEO of a company? And what would that do for me? And how would I relate to people? And what would I demand? And what would I expect from people who are around me? And what would I be disappointed about if people didn't behave that way? To go into the imaginative space, whether it's like meditative or journaling or, all sorts of things. And also connecting to the things, whatever the small pieces are in my life that relate to this character's life. Those are ways that I try to lean into it, and I think it's essential to be able to do that.
Is it? I mean, of course, it would be more difficult as a screenwriter versus writing prose as an author. Is it more just about show when you're a screenwriter, trying to show little tics, mannerisms that maybe are revealing what's inside the head of the character?
I think that's part of it. I also think it's, I'm really interested in languaging, like how things are spoken about, who's willing to say what and what are they not willing to say. So I think it's not only about what a character can demonstrate, but also what they're not willing to, where they're not willing to go. What is sort of left unsaid or left off the table. And the other thing I think too is for all of us is we can write it all through. We can always create a draft where the character says everything and does everything, and then go back in the rewrite and say, okay, now I'm going to take out 3 of these things and I'm going to have her say, two fewer or two, take out 2 of the things she says. And we can build that way too, and recognize that it's always a work. It can be a work in progress for us to do that too.
You said that a lot of your job as a TV writer is thinking about emotions of your characters and how they would react to different situations. Can we talk more about this process, about pouring emotions into characters?
Yeah, I think for me, like so many of the things in my writing space, this sort of goes back to that imagination and being in the headspace of what has happened before. So quite often I feel like I'm the person in the writer's room or who's thinking about in my own work, okay, this betrayal just happened. How am I going to be when I see that person next? What am I going to say? Are we going to resolve that thing? Or are we going to skip over it? Am I going to push in? Am I going to be angry and defensive? Or am I going to be passive and sort of let go? And quite often I'm thinking in those terms of those kind of like, what's the emotional approach? What's the verbal approach? And what does that look like? And what would feel natural to me if I were in that circumstance? And I would imagine that the character is going to do his or her or their version of that. And that's kind of what I'm always looking for. That's always what I have questions about too. As we begin to talk about in the writer's room, those sorts of things, I'm usually the guy who says, wait a minute, last time they saw each other, this happened. Or doesn't she expect Y? Or doesn't she want retribution for Z? And how does that color how she shows up in this scene or in this episode?
So if we use our example of Joe again at this gas station buying these cigarettes, let's suppose what we don't know as the audience member yet, but we'll find out, is that he actually got downsized from his company. He's 50. He hasn't told his wife yet. He's going to work every day. And now this is day 4. And so we see a heaviness and he's smoking. I don't know where I'm going with this.
Yeah. No, I think that for me, then the question is, when we see him with his wife, what's the order of operations? Is he going to pretend this day that he's still been going to work? Is this the day that he's going to tell her, and that's why he's buying the cigarettes? So the first thing that happens when he walks in, no matter what she says, is, I quit my job and I haven't been there for 3 weeks and I couldn't tell you, and I have to tell you today. Is he going to not go home? Is he deciding that this is the day he just leaves and, sends her a text like, can't do this anymore, and then disappears? Any of those things sort of infused with imagination becomes like a really juicy scene to write and to experience.
What is a scene?
What is a scene? Wow, what a great question. I would say a scene is an encounter between a character and a circumstance in a prescribed moment in time. So character enters and encounters something, and there's some change or exchange, and then the scene ends. I think a lot about, Robert McKee talks about energy and polarity changing in a scene. That ideally, if you have a character who comes in the scene super happy, then it's a great opportunity for the character to leave the scene in a different state. Now that doesn't always happen. It doesn't always happen as mechanically as that, but I do feel like the notion of witnessing change is what scenes are supposed to be about. Change, new information, something has to flip and morph for the scene to be, I think, most useful in moving a story ahead. Now that's not to say, certainly in the world of TV and film, we often have, clips of action or moments where one might say nothing happens. Somebody's walking down the street, or there's a pan of the sky, or a bird goes by, or whatever. And so we do have those sort of atmospheric things, but I think we are at our best as writers when we're motivating the story forward, where even in a small symbolic way, things happen. I think of that scene in, I think it's Tootsie, which is one of my favorite movies, where Dustin Hoffman is walking by, and there's the mime who's walking on the tightrope, which is what the movie is all about, and he pushes over the mime, and it's about, make a decision. It's about pushing himself to some other space. It's about, getting off the ledge and, making some sort of leap. And I think we can do that too in a symbolic way, but there is some change in that moment in time, in that scene, that makes that scene compelling.
Does every scene have a beginning, middle, and an end?
Yes, I think so, for sure. That's the way we sort of chart the movement of the scene, even in the smallest scenes, there is a journey from somewhere to someplace else. Yeah, and sometimes that's verbal. Sometimes it's like, I've come for the rent, and I don't want to give you the rent. You have to. Here's a gun. Oh, here's the rent, or whatever. Or here's my gun. There's some exchange in every scene. I think in the scenes that are most effective. Now there are exceptions to that rule, but I think we do well to have that in these scenes, like to motivate our story, to have change happen, to feel like we're on a journey, beginning, middle, and end. Change, transformation, even incrementally, is essential.
Aside from the Tootsie reference, is there a scene that just always stands out to you as like one of the most perfect scenes? I know you said nothing's really perfect, but...
Yeah, oh boy. Perfect scenes. Not perfect, but I love, and I've seen so many times, I'm a huge fan of Grey's Anatomy, and I've seen every episode, and I know a lot of people have not seen every episode and have a different opinion of the show, but I love, there's a scene at the very beginning of the pilot that where Meredith Grey is waking up after sleeping with Derek Shepherd for the first time, and she's trying to rush him along because she's like, I got to get to work. I can't be late on my first day, and he's doing some observations about her house and stuff like that, and she's just like, I got to go, And what's so great about that scene is it says so much about what's about to happen, like he's in her way, which is going to be a thing that happens in the series for much of the series. The fact that she's with him and the fact that she works in a hospital where she's going to find out that he's one of her bosses, is going to be this huge obstacle. And we don't know that at the time. It's just about a woman trying to get a guy out of her house so she can get to work on time. But it is about how he is inserted in her life and how that's a problem, and so we get this microcosm of all of that stuff in that little scene that is sort of a throwaway if you're just watching it for the first time, because you're like, okay, well, whatever, she just wants to get going. And it really is about so much more than that. And I think that's really beautiful. Like, I think we can all do that in some sort of layered, symbolic way that says something about the characters and the world and the conflict to come.
What is your process for editing a scene?
My process for editing a scene is so, I think there's probably some logic to it, but it can feel really haphazard. There are times when I go through a scene and I try to follow the argument, which is something that we talked a lot about when I was in acting school. That one of the things that I think actors want to do as they're doing a monologue or doing like, why am I saying this, and why does this follow that, and why does this come as a conclusion to this, and what do I say in response to that, and that's why I'm saying this. So I'm running through that in my head as I'm going through any scene. It almost feels like a tennis match to me. Okay, she said this, so what's the response here? And there are times when I will do that, put that down on the page in a sense of downloading, almost stream of consciousness, even though I've set up these circumstances so the characters are almost talking to each other. And then as I go back through, I may say, ooh, I don't really believe that moment anymore, or I don't know that she would say that, or that's not what this moment seems to be now. It seems like a bigger deal, or that there should be a pause, or less talking, or something else. And my instinct sort of swoops in and says, well, let's scoop that out. Let's get rid of that, whatever it is, that joke, that comment, that piece of banter doesn't work here anymore, because it seems like they're going more directly to this. And now that I'm revisiting the scene and coming back to this moment with these two people, I feel like I have hopefully a better idea of a more ideal version of their interaction. And so quite often the editing looks like that. It's just sort of me revisiting and going, oh, let's move this over here, or ooh, almost talking to the character, like, do you really want to say that? I don't know if that feels true to you, and then that line may disappear. Or, you seem to be ramping up into something more here that I didn't translate before. So maybe there's more for you to say, or maybe there's more of an elaboration here, or, and I certainly think that also happens too if I'm in a process where there's feedback, because other writers or other producers or, people in a writing group or whatever may say, I don't really understand this about this scene. And then sometimes that scene becomes about at least partially clarifying what these characters mean, what they're saying to each other, partly for the audience, but also for each other and for the scene. So they may say something a little more pointedly, or they may say something twice, or they may say something loudly, and then the volume gets turned up, or the shape seems to change. And I just try to follow those instincts of what the terrain of the scene is to get it a little more sculpted, a little more flowing than, each time around.
What is the all is lost moment?
The all is lost moment is the moment when we think there's no good outcome for the character, where it's just about, the character's not going to get what he or she or they want. It's just going to be, it's a disaster scenario. There's only one way, and it's going to be horrible. And, there's usually, almost always, an opportunity to turn that around, to kind of discover something new, or to think of it a new way, or to renegotiate what's wanted. I think a really good all is lost moment for me, when I witness it in a movie or a TV show, it usually sort of brings tears to my eyes, because I feel that kind of human, I feel the mortality of that character, like that person's not going to make it out, and then usually they do. So that's, it's like, how do you do that? How do you engineer that? I think it's a beautiful, if you can do it really well, it's a beautiful addition to a script.
Does the main character always have to reach that rock bottom moment?
Dramatically, it's a good place to see a character reach a rock bottom moment. I do think it's harder if you're doing episodic TV and you got to do that every week. It becomes a little less believable. And then I think what we end up doing is we kind of end up sort of shuffling who hits a rock bottom moment. In an adventure show, you can't necessarily put your lead character, in mortal danger every week, but maybe every fifth episode, maybe it's the supporting characters who have that, that desperate moment in episode 2, 3, and 4, and then you come back to the lead character doing it. I think in some sort of one-off, in a play or a film, it's a great thing if you can do it, and it's all a matter of how you set it up and how you sculpt it and how you can sort of put it down. And not every piece needs to do that, but I certainly think it's effective.
How does a writer know what the all is lost moment is for their main character?
I think if you establish well what the character wants, and you get to a point where that character is not going to get it ever, then you've hit that space. And, it's entirely possible that you can get to that moment with a character and then decide that the character is going to walk away without whatever he, she, or they thought they needed to get. That it's not possible, which is a kind of sort of a grief space. You can definitely hit that moment where it's kind of like, well, I'm not going to recover my relationship or my child or my job or my dignity, or I just have to walk away from this. This is not a useful pursuit for me. You can definitely have that moment.
How does this moment change the main character?
I think hopefully there's some new insight on the other side of that moment. Either that the character's more resourceful than the character thought that they were at the beginning, or that the character doesn't need what they thought they needed, or that the character has other options. Like, I feel like that's what that moment is all about. Like, that there's some other way of being moving forward, and that that it can be discovered, which I think, one of the reasons why I believe we all are watching TV and movies and plays is to learn something about survival and life. It's about the human condition and, storytelling that tells us what's possible as people. And I think the notion of coming out of an all is lost moment, recognizing that there's still the opportunity to survive and thrive on the other side of whatever tragedy, trauma, difficulty, challenge there is, to me that's like a huge, it's a huge way of modeling courage and persistence for all of us, that we can keep going, that I can keep going, even after hitting moments that seem impossible, that there's something on the other side of impossible. Like, I think that's a really good thing to know about, to carry with me. That I can survive and that I can move ahead like we all can. I feel like that's what these stories model for us.
Is instilling hope in a story important to you?
I think it is important. I really like stories that are life-giving. I know that's not true for everybody, but for me, I have, like everybody, like I will watch the news, and I've moved through difficulties and tragedies and challenges, and the sense of that it's worth it to keep at it, whatever it is, your life, your art, your job, your relationship, your health. Yeah, I feel like that's essential stuff. I feel like on some level that I'm on the planet to do that, to do some version of that. Not in like a treacly sort of like, pat sort of stereotypical or stale way, but in a way that's actually, that feels like, the other side of a good conversation, or the other side of a good, TED Talk or something. Like, there's a space of real hope and revitalization that I think is essential to, humanity, that we know that there's more, that we can do more, that we can be better. I think that's really what it's about.
And so you take that with you, or try to, with all the stories that you
I try to, yeah, even with the difficulty in it. One of the things my mother has said to me, which I think is really interesting, and I don't, because I'm more on the magical realism side than the horror side. But my mother said she's fascinated with horror and true crime stuff because the stories that she watches have the space of justice triumphing on the other side, so that you can face, the evil, the difficulty, the madness, and then sort of see that there is something on the other side that points toward redemption, that points toward like upliftment, and I really believe in that in stories, even the darkest stories, especially the darkest stories, because I feel like that's partly what entertainment is here to do. I feel like that's what I'm here to do, is to instill some hope in the middle of darkness, because there's so much darkness. And there's so much hope.
Something you said on your Secret Writer podcast when your co-host Nick Job was interviewing you is everyone teaches you how to do something, how to act, etc., but no one teaches you how to live as the person who does that. So I wonder if you can expand on that.
Yeah, this is one of the big, underlying ideas in I think my life, and certainly why I coach and help people and make YouTube videos and all that stuff. is that I spent a long time and am continuing to create stuff and learn how to create stuff, and I, studied theater in undergrad, and I, went to acting school, and I went to playwriting school, and I, also studied to be a coach. And I feel like people can say, like, do this, like, create a log line, here's how to do a character, here's how many scenes, a play has, or, could have, or a TV script or a movie. Those things are not easy, but fundamental, and on some level, even though lots of people have different theories, are universal. We can sort of agree at, the length of an hour drama, the length of a film or a play, and we can say, it sort of looks like this. But to live the life of a person who's doing that, who's creating those things, or auditioning, or trying to be a musician, or trying to be a singer, all of that stuff, like that day-to-day, how do you get up in the morning and inspire yourself to go back to rehearsal, to go back to the page, to work on another draft, to take another meeting, to, it's exhausting, and nobody talks about that. How do we sort of gather the energy of mentorship and friendship and spirituality and self-care and good eating and exercise? Like, how do we keep it going? And so that's partly why I think we've all seen, both personally and, nationally and internationally, we see artists burn out. We see artists burn out all the time, or fall apart in different ways. And I think there's so much to learn and so much to lean into each other about how do we do these things? How do we keep it going? And to be willing to ask each other, to be willing to ask our other writer friends or actor friends, or, or to hire a coach, or to, be in therapy, or to, go to your yoga class and do your meditation. Like, how do you lean into those things that are going to sustain you through the crazy ups and downs of an absolutely crazy, and probably always will be on some level, crazy industry? Like, that's a conversation that I'm always in, and that I'm really interested in helping foster and pass on, because I don't see people talking about that.
Right, and if you look at something, let's say, I know this has been a couple years with Baz Luhrmann's Elvis, and how this person that was just worshipped really became a victim of his own success through maybe a bad manager,
right,
things like that, and everybody wanting a piece of him. And
we see that all the time. So many stories, so many personalities, so many, you don't have to look far in the entertainment industry news to find new stories of those people who run into problems, or, start behaving badly, or whatever it is. It's like, how do we do this in a way that's nurturing, where we can be human beings and take care of ourselves, and, and still do our art? It's like, how do we do that?
And that your relationships will change too. The people around you, their reaction to you, different things.
Yes.
And so you always think about, hey, we're all hungry, we're all gonna come up together and stuff, and then friendships fall apart, or people don't want to speak to you anymore, and you don't know what happened. And So that's something that's not really, it's kind of taboo to talk about.
Yeah, right. And so how great would it be if we can get together as we, rise in whatever part of the industry we're in, and keep the conversation going. Say, like, oh yeah, I just won the Oscar, but today I'm feeling really depressed and I'm headed to therapy. Or, my show is up for an Emmy, but, I really, whatever, I really need to get more exercise, and I've just been in the house and I feel like I shouldn't go outside because everybody's, just to be in the conversation about those things that people aren't talking about. That is, this, for me, this is one of those invisible things that I'm obsessed with as a writer. It's like, how do we get to that underneath part that we need to explore as creative people, so that we stay healthy, creative people.
Another blog post, you talk about hope, and you said sometimes we feel less alone when talking about what's not working in our creative career, and how commiserating with others in the industry can seem enticing, but then sometimes complaining about our career actually hurts us. And it's easy to do, and sometimes, as a woman, a lot of times we bond over gossip and
Yes.
complaints, and I'm not saying men don't do it too, but that's how we kind of form friendships,
Yeah. It's easy to complain. It's really easy. And I think one of the reasons why it's easy is that the industry and I think society in general, we sort of make it seem like it's black and white. Like everything's amazing or everything's not amazing, right? And so how do we ground the conversation about what we're up to in a way that is normalizing, that doesn't have to be super ups and super downs, that doesn't have to be like, takedowns of each other or, one of the things that we do, I think, as we watch stuff and talk about it, you can see this language all across social media and, in interactions. Sometimes when people don't like a movie or a TV show, their language is so extreme. Like, I hate that show, those writers should be shot. Like, it's like, why are we doing that? And then the flip side, like, that's the perfect show. It's what about sort of the in-between way? What about being able to say, like, that show is for me, I really like it because I relate to this. That show, it's not for me. I know people like it, How do we find some sort of middle balance that then maybe speaks to how we can talk about our creative lives? Like, it's a good day writing. I feel pretty good about it. Or, not such a great day, but, I have hope that tomorrow will be better. Or, I think there's something in this piece that I'm working on, and why does it have to be the extremes? Why do we have to lean into hyperbole that I think then allows us to sort of pendulum swing into this, complaints or praise? Like, where's the middle ground, and how can we be kind not only to each other but to ourselves?
Right, and it's become a part of the culture, just hate, bonding over hating something or a certain celebrity or whatever, and it's unfortunate.
It is unfortunate
that it's become this new. Maybe it's always happened, but now with social media, it's just so much more easy to have a voice. So, sometimes you said to your clients, "What else am I doing with my life outside of writing?"
Yeah.
What's that about? That's interesting.
Yeah, I think. Writing, all of the arts, it's all an expression. I think it's all meant to be an expression of what it is we're doing on the planet. So if one is not doing anything else on the planet except writing, except striving to be that person, then what do we end up bringing to our art? Like, I have something to bring to my work if I've lived a life that then informs the next thing I'm going to bring to my work. If whatever, I don't need to necessarily sort of say that, like, volunteering, at a soup kitchen or a homeless shelter is better than other things. It's like, but are you out there? Are you gardening? Are you having good conversations? Are you talking to your neighbors? Are you surfing? Are you sculpting? Are you cooking? Like, any number of things that you get to do is going to inform the art that you get to do. And if you're not doing those other things, I'm not sure, eventually, I'm not sure what you're going to be bringing to your art if you don't have a life to reference, to talk about, to bring to the fore.
So much of our identity here in LA is based on what we're either doing or what we're striving to do.
Yep.
Most people come here from somewhere else, or even if they grew up here. And so it's so hard because that's all we're thinking about, or we're looking through the trades, what someone else in our industry is doing, that we want to be them.
Yeah, it's hard. It's hard. And I have my own version of that, wanting to sort of see what other people are doing and to recognize or to be hyper vigilant about what I'm not doing. But I think that's that's why I meditate. Like, that's why I go to therapy. That's why I hang out with my husband and, do social things and connect with people and go to see my parents and, take trips and do volunteer work or take a walk around the block. Like, all of those things will inform and help and enhance everything, So yeah, it's super hard to be in the bubble and to feel like it's all about the success. But part of the success, part of a successful life is the life part of the successful life.
You said about the sort of the protocol for someone pitching a cold, hey, can you read my script? Hey, can you help me with my book so I can turn it into? That we should, quote, build a bridge instead of ask. And I'm curious, what is bridge building? How is this done?
Yeah, I think, one of my big analogies is about, I call it being professionally homeless. If I walk up to or see a homeless person on the street and they ask me for money, I might give money, but that all depends on my mood. Do I have money? Am I in a hurry? It depends on a lot of different factors. All right. But if I said to you, or somebody said to me in this instance, my friend John, who I went to college with, who's really amazing, is now homeless, and he actually lives in your neighborhood, and you're going to see him today, probably, and at least say hello. You don't have to give him anything, but he's a really amazing guy. Like, exponentially changes my response to that person completely and totally. I will be then open, maybe I'll give money, I'll spend a little time. There's a bridge that's been built between me and that person. And I think that's what we really need to focus on when we talk about and think about networking. It's not just about getting stuff, right? It's really about how can I build a bridge of my personality, my energy, my thoughts, my feelings. Then I think I'm more likely, and I think lots and lots of people are more likely to eventually sort of entertain a professional ask. If I know you, or if you know me, then it's easier to say, hey, I would love some advice about such and such, or I'm trying to blah, 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 or, do you happen to know anybody over here because I've applied for a thing and would you put in a word for me? Like, that may happen if we built a relationship. It's going to be really hard to connect you, if you're a stranger, to somebody I know really well, because I don't know you. It's a risk, right? And so it's really about, I think that's what networking is, whether it's, however it is, whether it's through an agent or a manager, or just through like having coffee with somebody several times, to become more familiar, user-friendly. I think that's the way of the industry. It's a very social industry. It's not just about an exchange of material or exchange of ideas. It's really about building that bridge and getting to know people and letting them get to know you.
Do you think people, though, in other parts of either the world or the country, they don't realize, New York and LA, it's going to be less chummy and familiar than if you're like in a different, even part of California, where you could just probably see someone at the grocery store and strike up a conversation, and it's going to flow much differently than when you're in LA, because you're going to be like, ooh, they want something from me. What are they going to ask me?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's, I don't know, I think it's different in terms of the ease of that, but I also think it's similar in terms of the fact that people like to be approached as people, that it's really more about an exchange of ideas or a conversation than it is about gimme, 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 gimme. You can help me, give me this, give me that, I need, it's like, I think we all get tired of that, and even if we're in the mood to give, I mean, how many times, I get a lot of, because I like to do charitable giving, particularly at holiday time, I get a lot of things all year long from some of the same charities. I'm not going to give every time I get an envelope. It can't just be like, we need. I know you need. I totally get that, and I'm not dismissing the notion of that. But I do think that the personal relationship can change everything, and not in a manipulative way, but in a life-giving way. Why can't we have lunch and coffee and, see each other at a movie screening and, those sorts of things, be in a writing group together and, and then down the line, exchange ideas or exchange scripts or that sort of thing. I think it really makes a huge difference. And it's a long game. It's not just about, I need it now. It's a long game. And so we have to I think being in that process, that long game process of networking, I think it's a good thing.
How does a writer build a lasting career in this industry?
I think that it's a really good question. So the first thing is I want to say that I'm super grateful to have been around and working for more than a decade, and maybe that's already a lasting career. So I don't know that I'm the expert on the, I'll give you my thoughts, and I look forward to being around a long time, and who knows, ask Mel Brooks or somebody ask some legend who's been working in the industry for 60 years. But I think one way you do it is by being user-friendly. It's especially in the space of writers' rooms, we in writers' rooms spend, 8 to 10 hours a day together for 6 months or more. And so those meetings when you meet with showrunners and other writers and producers, they really want to know, at that point, they know that you're a good writer, but it's are you fun to be around? Are you good conversationalists? What are your ideas like? Are you needy? Are you funny? Are you friendly? Are you kind? Are you open? Are you human? And I think those things that people want to know about writers' rooms are the things people want to know in general. I've definitely gotten work from producers I met, 6, 8 years ago because they remember having a great conversation with me. And then it's easier to make that connection with perhaps my agent or my manager, or I run into them and they say, oh my God, we've got this thing and I was thinking blah, 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 you'd be perfect for, it's that. It's being user-friendly and being a human being. And also recognizing that I think, the whole thing about the industry is to find your peeps. Not everybody loves me. Not everybody loves my work. Not everybody loves me. And that's going to be the same for everybody out there. We all have to be willing to say, these folks who really get me, I'm going to lean into them. And these folks who don't get me, it's okay. I can't expect everybody to get me. I don't get everybody. In the same way that I can't expect to love everything on TV, I don't love everything on TV. So why should I expect everybody who makes TV to love the things that I make? It's just not logical. So all of that, being grounded, being user-friendly, and showing up as you for the people who dig you. I think that's what it's about.
That's great. And I love, too, what you said, I think, on the Secret Writer podcast, and it was something about how when you do get into a discussion and it does get serious, that to be bold but balanced. I thought that was really well put. I like that.
Thank you.
Especially in this day and age where it's very, we all have to choose our words very carefully.
Yes,
and we don't even realize maybe we're offending someone and we didn't mean to.
Right.
Or it could just be by the nature of who we are, we're seen as offensive and we don't mean to, we're not trying to do that. It's just very delicate today.
Yeah, it can be, yeah.
So,
and I think a lot of that we can manage by leaning into what we like. There's always that question, or sometimes in a writer's meeting for a show where somebody will say, okay, you saw this thing that we made, what would you have done differently? And it's really important I think, to language that in terms of, well, what I was interested in most was X, and I would have loved to see more of that X, more of the relationship between these characters or whatever, as opposed to, well, you didn't do blah, 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 and I didn't like such, It's just a matter of how you handle it. You can answer that question in a way that leans into what you love, and I feel like that's part of the opportunity there.
So, I like that because you're keeping it open. I'd like to know more instead of the finger pointing, you're bad. Yeah,
exactly.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
We need more of that in the world.
We do.
And online.
Yeah.